In this movie, we witnessed the most important impacts due to climate change on planet Earth, and we are not exaggerating if we said that these years are very decisive in order to solve this problem. I would like to welcome our panelists who will be with us in this session on the platform. Dr. Mustafa Madbouli, the Prime Minister of Egypt. Mohammed Nasr, Ambassador, the Director of Sustainable Development and Environment in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the consultant of the African negotiators. Cassie Pline, the strategic consultant on climate change in the Executive Bureau of the United Nations Environment Program. Aqil Hajjat, the founder of C12 for environmental and developmental consultations in Africa. Karim Tarraf, CEO and co-founder of Hawa Sawa. And Mark Koschlet, consultant advisor in Open Earth Foundation. And we will also have a group of speakers remotely. But let us start from the podium, and we will start with Dr. Mustafa Madbouli, the Prime Minister of Egypt. The Egyptian experience is a very special experience. How did we address it in COP26, and how we will go with this experience to COP27? In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, His Excellency President Fattah Sisi, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt, August Gathering, it's an honor to be amongst you in the World Youth Forum in its fourth session, which is discussing a very pivotal issues discussing humanity in general. In the most important session at the level of the forum, where we have been honored with the participation of their excellencies presidents, on top of which our Excellency President Abdel Fattah Sisi, who tackled their vision for the world post-corona and how the world will be, and the experience of each and every country in tackling and addressing this pandemic that has affected the whole humanity. But all agreed that the topic of climate change is, in fact, a very important issue at all levels, and it should be, in fact, met decisively and to expedite dealing with this challenge to solve issues in the coming future. In the last 25 years, when we had international experts who in fact warned us about climate change, our receiving to these issues that they were predictions or pessimistic predictions, and that it will not happen during our existence, and generation of the future will witness these repercussions of the climate change. In my introduction, in the 10 seconds that we talked, more than 10,000 ton metering of greenhouse gases emission every 10 seconds, and these are equal to 170 in fact weight of individuals. We are witnessing the repercussions and the ramifications of climate change. In fact, in the North Pole is now suffering the rising of temperature and carbon dioxide emission. The increase of sea level that many places are suffering from this is a result due to the high emissions of carbon dioxide. As you can see the curve, we started in 1960s and now we are moving towards 2023, and this resulted in the increase in the average of temperature of Earth planet and decrease in the quality of air, climate phenomena which is extreme, and increase of sea level. And according to the estimations of all experts who said that since 1970 till to date we have losses around $3.6 billion and the annual figure dealing with climate change starting 2030, the estimation cost, it will be 30 from 280 to 500 billion US dollars annually. Only in 2021 we had 10 disasters at the international level. We are followed, whether in Europe, United States, China. Its losses led to more than 170 billion US dollars. So today we are talking about a phenomena which is very serious and threatening the human being. Beside to all what I have mentioned, the whole world witnessed that due to the increase in temperature, more deaths and loss of lives, particularly within the age bracket of 65 years of age, and they were around 350,000, and we will even more loss of lives will be added by 2050. We will be in fact close to 2 million individuals who will be dying due to the phenomena of climate change and its repercussions. And due to these impacts, we expect to have 325 million individuals will be suffering from abject poverty, and 216 million individuals will be forced for internal migration due to desertification, climate change, and so forth. Hence, the problem that the whole world is referring to, and warning and alarming that the environmental crisis rate will double 3 times in the coming period. Weather, hot waves, destruction of crops, fires in forests, and we all have witnessed all these phenomena last year. Hence, what is being said that our children will be facing 3 times environmental crisis and disasters that have been faced by us. In fact, children under the age of 5 will die out of air pollution. Now the world is moving, starting the framework United Nations agreement, Kyoto Protocol, and the most important agreement, Paris for the climate change 2015. All these agreements and convention, the whole world are setting a mechanism to take executive and organizational measures. Was the COP26. The COP26 that was held in Glasgow came out with a number of recommendations and decisions to agree in activating Paris Convention that was suspended. A number of developed countries withdrawn, but now it is being activated, and we agreed that countries who will in fact share in financial contribution have been activated as with new pledges for funding to face this important and critical phenomenon, particularly developing countries. In case of Egypt, developing countries were not the reason behind this phenomena, but now it is committed at the rest of the world to pay the cost and the bill dealing with this issue beside other countries worldwide. Hence, it's very important for developed countries who were the main reason behind this phenomena to have their major contribution in this area. We had new negotiators to estimate funding and to deal with the topic and what kind of mechanisms of implementation that will be used. And Mr. Antonio Guterres, who said that it was a very important and significant step, but it's not enough. Here comes the importance of COP27 that will be hosted by Egypt in this beautiful city of Sharm el-Sheikh by the end of this year in order to set together the executive framework for this issue. We as a humanity have very important topics and issues to reduce emissions and to have targets and figures at the level of the world, adaptation, funding, and it's very important to provide the necessary funding for these mega projects and to have mechanisms for following up and monitoring to make sure that what we have agreed upon will be implemented. Where Egypt in this topic? Let me talk about how the world is looking upon Egypt regarding climate change. Egypt is one of the most countries who will be subjected to the repercussions of climate change, despite its responsibility is very limited. But Egypt will be one of the most countries who will be affected by the negative impact of climate change. Our figures says that Egypt contributions is 0.6% of all emissions at the international level. This is a very, in fact, low contribution, but we will be majorly and will be negatively affected by this phenomenon, the increase in sea level and the drowning of many cities, or a number of cities. But the world say that Egypt has a huge capabilities regarding new and renewable energy, and the announcement said by Richard that Egypt owns the biggest capacity of energy, electricity and wind in North Africa. But despite of that, Egypt has a plan to double this energy by 300% in the coming period, so that new and renewable energy will be a very important part, and Egypt, beside United Emirates, will lead this direction with other countries in the region. Egypt will be the faster market for hydropower taken from the dams, but will be one of the faster countries in development and one of the biggest 5 countries with the expected increase in the production of renewable energy at the level of the Middle East and the Arab region. Hence, Egypt is in fact attractive for investments in producing energy and power, and we are one of the biggest countries, in fact, formulated laws and regulations and legislations producing renewable energy, and we have jumped 20 ranks regarding the policies related to climate change. Egypt also is one of the most important countries producing green hydrogen, and also international agency. And in every slide, I will be putting the international source talking about this. It's not us talking, but the world. What are the efforts that should be exerted by Egypt to counter climate change? From the first minute, the presidential directions is to establish the National Council for Climate Change, presided by the cabinet and the relative ministers, in order to set the mechanisms to deal with climate change. We are moving, in fact, in 5 pivotal axes. In fact, we have low reduction, but most of it was coming out from traditional energy. So we will be rationalizing emissions coming from this traditional and to exploit new and renewable energy and gas, and to reduce emissions from fossil fuel, and to benefit from new energies that, in fact, with less carbon dioxide emission, and to reduce energy transfer, and to produce energy and to use it in the same place. We launched the National Strategy for Climate Change through this Council, implementing mega projects, and we'll be tackling it in brief, whether in terms of adaptation or to reduce impact of climate change. We issued the first green bonds, and we were one of the first countries issuing green bonds depending on its projects, and we issued these bonds, and it was one of the first countries, and all, in fact, commended this initiative. And the most important thing, that we set important policies to encourage private change to participate through the electricity tariff and transferring wastes to energy. In fact, we started to be concerned with climate change, and we set the national plan for water resources till 2037. Egypt is one of the is the most poor country regarding water, and in COP27 this year in Sharm el-Sheikh, how the world will deal with water scarcity and water pollution, and Egypt has pioneered experience in this issue that we set a plan for 2037. We have been implementing this plan for 5 years. The cost of this plan is more than 50 billion US dollars. The Egyptian state is implementing mega projects in water desalination and treatment of agricultural wastewater and sanitation, and to make use of each and every drop of water. Egypt is one of the highest countries in exploiting water drops. One of the most important mega projects implemented by Egypt, rationalization of water, and to benefit from each and every drop of water, protecting shores. And this is a huge project implemented by the Egyptian state for the threatened areas in North Delta, and how that we are conducting projects with partners in development, and the persistence of the Egyptian state to adopt all these projects and to develop water lakes. And these lakes were neglected for hundreds of years, and we lost many lakes, and the quality of these lakes was affected negatively. We are implementing on ground full development for these lakes, and I will give you one example. One of them, developing El Manzala Lake, with its area 250 faddan. The cost is estimated by $2 million US to restore this lake. All these are mega projects implemented by the Egyptian state to counter climate change and to address it. As for the new and renewable energy, our plan that we will reach by the end of this year from 20% of the total generated energy will be new and renewable energy, but the objective before 2035, it will be 42% the energy in Egypt, and the power will be generated from new and renewable energy. And also the project that was opened with Excellency the President in Aswan, solar energy and the new renewable and new energy. We are implementing a very huge project for the, in fact, natural gas to be extended to different villages to replace, in fact, the traditional one, in order to have a clean environment. And we are producing electric vehicles in order to depend on the fuel of these cars, to depend on electricity and on the clean fuel. Also in the collective transportation, we are implementing new system for collective transportation, the electric train, the monorail, and also we have a network of more than 2,000 kilometers being implemented and will be implemented in a few years in order to cope with climate change and to reduce harmful emissions. And also this a new generation of green cities. They are all smart cities depending on green and sustainable cities. And today we are talking that all governmental buildings, whether in the new capital or even in the existing cities, we will introduce solar energy in order to reduce its consumption for the traditional energy. Also another program, transforming wastes to energy, and the integrated management for the wastes regarding the management and recycling of these wastes, and solid waste to be transformed to biogas and to energy. And this is also one of the most important projects.
The Egyptian state, Egyptian government has an investment plan in order to have the majority as green projects. So 30% of the state projects are actually green projects, and we target 50% of the investment projects of Egypt to be green projects. So this means that all projects that have to do with development infrastructure are essentially green or eco-friendly projects. On top of which is Haya Karima, or this decent living project. This is a project that His Excellency the President pointed out to yesterday, and this aims at improving the quality of life of Egyptian citizens, especially in rural areas, and main component of it has to do with climate change when it comes to adaptation and mitigation. And through COP27 and hosting this conference is to actually target the African continent and developing nations. This conference that will be held in Sharm el-Sheikh should be a mouthpiece where these nations and countries would be able to express their needs and start and launch initiatives that would help with this phenomenon. At the national level, we work on reducing plastic consumption. We have an initiative for green incentives for the private sector in Egypt, also coordinating between Egyptian think tanks, and we are going to have an award for green innovation and green projects. And I would like to conclude by telling our youth something about the role, because it's a key role in the future. In fact, all international projects come from national projects that are outside of the box, based on the innovation of youth and Egyptian youth when it comes to Egypt, of course. This is why we are really keen on working on knowledge transfer and exchange in the upcoming period in order to encourage our youth on innovation and the implementation of all innovative ideas to achieve the targets. We don't want to take any idea lightly, because here I say that any small group of committed citizens are able to change the world. This might be a lot to say, but this is our hope for the future, really. Thank you. Thank you, Your Excellency Mustafa Madbouli, Prime Minister of Egypt, for presenting the Egyptian experience in countering climate change. This is a very important experience, and we will try to tackle its most important points throughout the discussion. Allow me now to go to the second speaker of this session, and he is Mr. John Kerry, the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, and he has a very famous quote. He was negotiating for stopping wars, but now he is fighting for an existential issue, which is climate.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be able to be with you, and thank you very, very much for inviting me to join you for this important meeting early in the year as we get ready for Sharm el-Sheikh. I want to thank President Sisi for his leadership on this issue and his commitment to have the government of Egypt sponsor the next COP, COP27. I'm very glad to be able to help celebrate Egypt's leadership on climate and its readiness to engage young people around the world, recognizing that it is young people who have really been asking the adults to behave like adults and get the job done. And so I think your participation in this as young people is absolutely critical. If I could take a moment, I'd like to pay my respects to Foreign Minister Sami Shukri. He is a good friend from our years together when he was Foreign Minister and I was Secretary of State. And I also want to thank Minister Fuad, who has been a close partner in this through Glasgow and now will be called on to exercise great leadership as we go forward towards Sharm el-Sheikh. Let me just say that I understand full well that those of you who are in a younger generation are somewhat frustrated today. And I want you to understand that I and many others who are older than you share that frustration. The scientists have told us unequivocally that we have about the next 8 years within which we must make the critical decisions and implement them in order to avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. And now today, in every country in the world, no one is spared. Every country, people are feeling the consequences of this climate crisis. We've seen fires, unprecedented, out of control. We've seen record levels of heat. We see the Antarctic, where just the other day a massive ice sheet broke off. So I understand your frustration. We accepted the responsibility in Glasgow again of trying to hold the Earth's temperature increase to about 1.5 degrees. And I'm proud to tell you that 65% of global GDP has signed up to do exactly that. The biggest challenge we all face right now is to get our systems, our government systems, the private sector joined with it, to actually move fast enough. And right now, we're not. So I hope we can rely on all of you to bring the pressure to bear that is necessary. This is not a transformation that we have to be scared of. This is really important to grab onto. The economic opportunities are gigantic. Millions of jobs can be created as we build out new energy systems, as we build electric vehicles instead of internal combustion engine vehicles, as we build smart grids in our country where we can take solar from one part of the nation and send it to another part of the nation, or wind power, which could even be sold to other countries if you have a surplus of power. The fact is that this is the largest market, the energy market, that the world has ever known. And if we do what we say we're going to do, this is going to be an exciting transformation. In the end, my friends, this is the way we build better security for all of our nations. We will need to deploy trillions of dollars of investment to help us make this transformation. And happily, I can tell you, many of the major financial institutions of the world have already stepped up and said that they are prepared to make those investments, providing the governments do the things necessary to help to facilitate the deployment of that money by having good regulations, transparency, accountability, honesty in the data. And if we do all of those things, we can win this battle. So Egypt and Africa are going to play a very critical role in helping to set the mark and help us meet these goals, and particularly on adaptation, mitigation, on dealing with methane, on deforestation, and other critical pledges and commitments. We stand poised to be able to deal with the worst of what is predicted by avoiding it, by preventing it in the first place. And we can build resilience and do a lot more for adaptation as we move down that road. So my friends, I look forward to working with President Sisi. I look forward to working with all of you as we do what is necessary to win this battle. Together, we really do have the ability to win a future that is better for all of us.
كي ننتصر في هذه الحرب سويا.
In order to triumph in this battle, we need to cooperate together. This was the speech of His Excellency Mr. John Kerry, U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change. And if the way to Sharm el-Sheikh starts from Glasgow, then we need to go back to Glasgow, actually, in order to know what happened there. We have Mr. John Martin, the Special Envoy of Climate for the UK. Mr. John, welcome.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency President Sisi, Prime Minister Mabduli. Thank you very much for hosting today's event and being ready to host COP27 later this year in Glasgow, in Egypt. Colleagues and friends, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to address this forum today on behalf of Alok Sharma, the COP President. It's an exciting week for the UK and Egypt, as the COP President, Alok Sharma, will be visiting Cairo on Friday, and I know he's greatly looking forward to meeting many of you in person and to discussing how we can cooperate together and support Egypt in making a success of COP27. I'm very pleased to be here today at this youth forum. Young people continue to be absolutely central to tackling climate change. 61% of Egypt's population is under 30. I was most recently working overseas as our ambassador in the DRC, where half of the population are aged under 19. And obviously such young populations, many more of those people will stand a really good chance of getting to survive into the year 2050, unlike some of us in the older generation. And so we'll experience the effects of climate change. And it's my 17-year-old daughter who reminds me that the costs of climate change set out by Prime Minister Mabduli will fall disproportionately on young people. It's young people that will be most affected by climate change. And therefore, youth engagement was a real priority for our presidency, our incoming presidency ahead of COP26. And we will work through this, our presidency year in 2022, ahead of Sharm el-Sheikh, to gain insights from diverse young climate leaders as we continue to try to implement the agreements that were made at Glasgow. I want to leave you with three brief messages today. Firstly, the UK is proud of what we achieved in Glasgow, and I'm sure that in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt will deliver similar success. At Glasgow, we were able to keep the potential to limit the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees C alive. As Alok Sharma has said, the pulse is weak, but and the figures vary, but the potential for us to limit the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees C remains alive. Various non-government organizations have done calculations and say that if we meet and deliver on our 2030 commitments, we will limit the rise in global temperatures to around 2.4 degrees. And if we can deliver on what we've promised ahead up to 2050, we may limit the rise in global temperatures to around 1.9 degrees centigrade. It's not 1.5, but it shows that we are actually bending the emissions curve and that more progress can be made. At Glasgow, we were able to tackle the issue of climate finance to support those countries adapt to climate change and to make the transition to low carbon economies themselves. And donor countries like my own demonstrated that we would be delivering over $500 million of climate finance between 2021 and 2026. We won't hit the $100 billion target in 2021. We wouldn't have hit it in 2021, but we are making progress on the finance issue, and we know that's hugely important. The Glasgow outcome document was the first that mentioned the need to reduce our use of coal, the most potent of the fossil fuels in terms of climate impact, something that people didn't think was possible in an outcomes document ahead of Glasgow. And we're very grateful for the support of Egypt and others in enabling that, and noting that Egypt leads the way in its reduction of coal power globally. We've brought together in Glasgow an alliance of 34 nations to end financial support internationally for fossil fuels, which will enable $24 billion a year to be shifted from fossil fuel support and towards investment in renewables, to ensure that we have the clean power we need to drive our economies in the future and to tackle climate change. And at Glasgow, we saw huge progress on adaptation, which is hugely important in countries that are going to be most affected by climate change. And we finalized the Paris rulebook. But the second thing that we need to stress is much more needs to be done. We know that. We need to now deliver on our promises, what countries committed to at Glasgow, and Special Envoy Kerry mentioned the number of countries who've committed to net zero. What countries committed to at Glasgow now needs to be put into place. We need to ensure, and as presidency we will be working this year, to make sure that countries who committed to net zero are setting themselves on the paths towards those goals. Prime Minister Mabduli set out the costs of climate change, and so we mustn't allow ourselves to be discouraged by claims that climate action and reducing our emissions means lower growth. We know that's not true anymore. Solar power is the cheapest power the world has ever known, and there are huge opportunities in Egypt and many other nations to generate wealth at the same time as tackling climate change. And from my own experience in countries like the DRC, I see that solar energy has far more capacity to bring lighting and power and electricity into rural areas than old thermal technology. We need, over the course of the current year, to encourage countries who haven't submitted NDCs to come forward and do so that we can raise our ambition globally. And we look forward to working with those who've yet to submit an NDC and encourage them to do so. And over the course of the year, we'll be working with other donors to make progress on the quantity and quality of finance to support countries in making their transitions to a low carbon economy. And of course, during the course of the year, the third point I want to make, we want to build a strong partnership with our Egyptian friends as the incoming presidency to ensure that there's continuity and coordination between COP26 and COP27, and then of course in due course the United Arab Emirates, who will be the host of COP28. The UK and Egypt face different concerns in some ways in terms of climate change. Prime Minister Mabduli spoke of water shortage. In the UK, our concern as a result of climate change is more related to flooding and increased rainfall. But that diversity will help us work together well. And I can think of no better host for COP27 than Egypt, with its founding member of the non-aligned movement and as a sort of a renewables superpower in the making. Later this week, our COP President Alok Sharma will be in Cairo and we'll be discussing more closely with our Egyptian friends how we can take this challenge forward to ensure that the negotiations at COP27 are a success, to support investment in low carbon projects, and to support Egypt as it takes steps to further green its economy. Thank you.
شكرا لسيد جون مارتن المبعوث الخاص للمناخ لحكومة المملكة.
Thank you, Mr. John Martin, the special envoy of the United Kingdom. Now we'll be talking with Ambassador Mohammed Nasser, the head of Sustainable Development, Climate Change, and the head of the negotiators in Africa. And it's very important. The question is to know the answer of the question. African and developing countries, how will they be able to face challenges to implement programs in order to face climate change? Thank you, Your Excellency, President Fattah al-Sisi, Your Excellencies, August Gathering. Before I answer the question, I would like to refer to three important points. In fact, they are political negotiations in terms of climate change. The second aspect, climate change is not an environmental matter, but it is a developmental, as the development, in fact, types and development will be different, as we heard from John Biden and else, starting agriculture, trade. All economic sectors will be affected due to climate change. The delegation of Egypt is a delegation between Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Trade. Regarding funding is led by Egypt for the African Group for Developing Countries. At the level of experts is led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At the ministerial level is led by the Minister of Environment, as we listen to Mr. John Kerry, appreciating the role and the efforts of Egypt in negotiation. This is the first part. You asked me how developing countries will deal with the challenges imposed by climate change. We have a major part, which is funding. As His Excellency Prime Minister referred to it, we have impacts and we have needs for developing countries through our membership in the negotiation and membership in funding committees. We can say that we have three major points represent challenge to developing countries in terms of dealing with climate climate change from the funding aspect. The gap between the needs of developing countries and what's available in financing. In the last definition was the needs of developing $3.5 trillion till 2030, while the flow of funding going to developing countries does not exceed $600 million US. So we have a funding gap, which is a huge, and I think that we have to deal with it strongly, and the status of developing countries are clear. The proportionality of financial instruments with the needs and the circumstances of developing countries. Most available funding is a funding in the form of loans, commercial loans specifically, and concessional finance is very limited. Many countries, particularly in the African continent, are facing a problem to take loans because simply they are countries with high debts, hence decision makers face the problem to take more loans, and of course this will be on the burden of the coming generations. So how they will deal with the dilemma of providing funding and also with climate change impacts and economic transformation, and the funding from donor in fact countries is still in the form of loans and not concessional loans. The final point, accessibility to funding. In order to take the loan, the conditions that and the requirements from the funding institutions, in fact, makes it difficult for the countries in Africa, in fact, to have accessibility for available funding or accessibility to financing institutions. This is a challenge facing developing countries. In the negotiations, we are trying through the decisions coming out from the state parties. We come out with the guidance from the international community and financing agencies. We are putting this on top of the agenda. And in Glasgow, we listened to Mr. John Kerry, and he talked about trillions and 100 million. Of course, the difference between 100 million and trillions, but the process and the policies in order to transfer from trillions to millions is still in the hands of financing agencies. They are still committed to the measures that are taken previously, and people seeking loans, they should have a bankable projects that could be implemented on grounds and to achieve financial returns. And we have to bear in mind the dimension of climate change and also the environmental dimension. I don't want to be lengthy. The pressure of developing countries and the African countries is to deal with the 3 points. First point, to direct and to have concessional finance and to focus on, in fact, on grants and not on loans. The third part, try to deal with the international financing agencies to change the mindset as they don't bear in mind the importance to accelerate our transformation in order to implement all our needs and projects. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Mohammed Nasr, the head of the administration of climate environment in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's very important to know, while talking about the way to Sharm el-Sheikh Summit COP27, it's very important to go back to Glasgow Summit. And going back to the forum, Mrs. Cathy Flynn, the Strategic Council for Climate Change, the Executive Bureau of the United Nations Environment Program. What are the objectives that we assume to come out from Glasgow Summit?
It is an honor to be here. Thank you so much, President Sisi, the government of Egypt, Honorable Prime Minister. Thank you for initiating these discussions. It is these moments where we all come together to be able to reflect on these international negotiations that help to pave the way for openings and for moments, dare I say, of hope in being able to address the climate crisis. You asked about Glasgow, and certainly Glasgow gave us some steps forward. They were not the leaps that we needed or that we had hoped for, but there are moments that are helping to pave the way toward enhanced climate action. And the first is really on these national pledges. Countries came to Glasgow with national pledges and able to say that they were going to make bold moves on energy, bold moves on adaptation, bold moves on protecting nature, and being able to start on the road down toward sustainable development. And when we look at this, and while we say, oh, pledges on paper may not mean much, these pledges do mean a great deal. Because the first round of pledges that were submitted in 2015, when we added them together, they put us at a range of about 2.5 degrees temperature rise, which puts us in a very, very dangerous territory. But now, 6 years later, with these revised, with these enhanced pledges, they put us on a track that is much more closer to 1.5. And while we have a long way to go, while we have much urgent action that needs to be taken, we are on this pathway. And this is where COP27 is so critically important. Well, Glasgow gave us plans, they gave us words, they gave us ways that we can have a direction moving forward. Now, with COP27, we can start to see that transformation. We can start to talk about what it takes to turn these pledges into action. What types of bold moves on energy? I've been hearing so much, and thank you so much, Honorable Prime Minister, for sharing some of these plans in Egypt that are, I think, models for the rest of the world as you are thinking about these big choices that have to be made. Also, in thinking about increasing resilience to climate impacts, access to technology, access to the finance that the ambassador was talking about. These are the levers that will help turn some of these pledges into real action on the ground. And this is the challenge ahead of us at Sharm el-Sheikh, to be able to turn this into a momentum, turn this into transformation where we can really see some of these impacts on the ground. And I think, finally, when it comes to the road from Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh, we have to talk about hope. Because as people are looking around the world, and we've heard so much from youth about how scared they are, they see these wildfires, they see extreme heat, they see drought, and it can be very, very overwhelming. And for Sharm el-Sheikh, and I'm looking at the walls here, development, humanity, peace, creativity, this is the perfect place to have these discussions, because that is what we need when it comes to the climate crisis. It is bringing all of these pieces together to be able to think out of the box, to be able to push the envelope, to be able to cause this transformation that the world so desperately needs, and to be able to tell that story, and for Egypt to be able to lead the way in telling that story about what transformation really looks like on the ground. So thank you very much, and looking forward to further conversations.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cassie Flynn, a strategic consultant for climate change in UNDP, and she spoke about hope, how important hope is to solve this problem. However, it's really important to shed light on the problem in order to be able to tackle it outside of the box, like you said. Let's now head to Ms. Inger Anderson, the Executive Director of the UN Environment Program. She's here with us remotely, actually. And Ms. Anderson, what are the most important challenges that the Middle East and Africa will be facing, especially when it comes to local communities?
Start by expressing appreciation to Egypt for hosting this conference. It's obviously very, very critical, and my deep appreciation to President Sisi for his strong leadership in this regard, and of course to Prime Minister Madbouli and Foreign Minister Shukri. We expect to see Egypt step into the very same role that they had when they held the presidency for the biodiversity COP, which Egypt hosted in Sharm el-Sheikh in 2014 with great success. So let me just say that, yes, we got a long way in Glasgow, and we appreciated that. And we very much appreciated that. But of course, we have a long way to go. We saw that, and we just heard that from the colleague from UNDP, we saw that there has been an increase in commitments by countries, and we salute that. But the increase is not enough. And when we understand that the G20, these 20 economies, are responsible for 76% of all emissions, we have to understand that the strong commitments need to happen where it needs to happen in those larger emitting countries. And so that is where the emphasis needs to be right now when it comes to mitigation. When we speak about adaptation, we have to be sure that the promises we make way back in COP15 in Copenhagen, where we said that by 2020, we will have 100 billion on the table every year. That promise has not yet been met, and yet our calendar says 2022. So there is another to-do item there for the countries that have the responsibility to put money on the table. And indeed, we heard that just now from Mohammed Nasr. So I think that there are some critical issues that we need to not glaze over and have a very honest conversation about. Now, don't get me wrong, Glasgow was a great success. We got some very important elements. We got the first mention ever of coal. We got the first mention ever of subsidies. Not quite as strong as we might have liked, but there it was. We got a commitment on methane, and we're very proud of that. We saw a louder voice across the world on key issues, and that was critical too. But we have to-do items, because when we add it all up, and that is, of course, what UNEP does in our emissions gap report, when we looked at all the NDCs pre-COP Glasgow, we were heading towards a world in 2021 at 2.7 degrees. Then we said, okay, let's take all the commitments that have been made during Glasgow, and we take the goodwill of the net zero commitments, even though they're not quite as clear as they should be, and they mix some of the gases up, etc., and are not quite clear. We take all of that, and where do we land? We land at 2.3 degrees. So friends, we have ways to journey, and the to-do item lies with the biggest emitters. And we are very happy that we saw some leaning in, but there's more to be done, because if not, we will see more storms, more floods, more wildfires, more water shortages, and more displacement. And that cannot happen. So the good news is we still have time to change. We can still, with determination, with activism, with energy, with ideas, and with youth at the forefront, build a greener and more prosperous world. And I mention youth at the forefront, not to let other generations abscond from their responsibility. I mention youth to encourage youth to be that brave and powerful voice, to be that tireless energy, and to reverberate in social, in economic, in political, and in environmental spheres. And the work starts right now. We need to shift into emergency gear, which is why it is so critical that Egypt, under its heads of state, President Sisi, has convened this meeting with young voices there, with leadership across the world, with ambassadors present, with that commitment. We have this year, before we head to Sharm el-Sheikh, some opportunities to push. And here, of course, I want to mention a United Nations Environment Program, because Egypt has been a strong builder of UNEP and obviously a strong architect of UNEP during our journey. We turn 50 this year, and we will be hosting in March here in beautiful Nairobi, from where I speak to you, UNEP at 50. And later on, we will be hosting Stockholm Plus 50 and of course, World Environment Day. And there are abilities there to really push on the issue of climate and on youth activism. Now, many of the young people in the audience may say, but how do I get involved? And that is a word that we often hear. But look, you really have an opportunity to change, to consider how you can be the change makers. You can become the brave voices inside corporate organizations. You can use your vote to put in place leaders that are leaning in on this issue. You can obviously push for your schools, your faith groups, your organizations to really move in this direction. You can organize and start green businesses, and you can absolutely ensure that you make your own footprint less and organize your families across the world to do likewise. We clearly have a lot of work to do. We all have to play our part. Egypt has shown amazing leadership by, as I said, holding the presidency for the Biological Convention, the 14th COP, in Sharm el-Sheikh, and the long presidency because of COVID and the delay. And now Egypt will lead the next conference of parties on climate change to take place in beautiful Sharm el-Sheikh again later this year. We need more such leadership, together working across generations, fired up by the energy of youth. We can change the world. And youth are not willing to settle into the same groove that has worn deep wounds into our planet. You're not willing to just be part of the future. You can and must define the future because it is yours. So allow me to close in the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's passing we all mourn this month. Do your little bit of good where you are. It's those little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world. Thank you.
شكرا سيدة إنجر أندرسون.
Thank you, Mrs. Anderson, the Executive Director of the UN Environment Program. 10 years ago, there was no concern on shedding light on climate and climate change and the risks of climate change and its impacts. But now the media internationally, in fact, are very much concerned with this issue. And now we have Mr. Bill Wayne, CNN announcer, chief climate correspondent. In fact, the biggest natural, what were the biggest natural phenomena that you monitored? You can tell us about this, please.
For having me. Hello to all of you in Egypt. Very fond of your country and so honored to be part of this here today. I've been everywhere this summer. I was stood on the Iceland, on the Greenland ice sheet and watched the melting there that is going to change coastal communities from Sharm el-Sheikh to Boston to Shanghai. I stood and watched the wildfires that raged across the American West. I was there for hurricanes that started in the Gulf Coast of the United States and ended up thousands of miles away, drowning people in their basement apartments in New York City. We had tornadoes, which are supposed to happen in the middle of the summer, in the middle of winter in the American heartland. And so it is everywhere. 2021, at least in my country, was by far the deadliest and most expensive. It beat the record set in 2020 by $50 billion, by hundreds of lives. And so it is in our faces every day. But unfortunately, the way human nature works is we're all made of stories. You know, everything in our lives, our borders, our flags, our currencies, are stories that we've agreed upon. And those stories are always changing. But this story doesn't seem to be changing fast enough because we don't have a massive event, a 9/11, for example, of climate change. Because it happens sporadically around the world, human psychology is able to dismiss it. And unfortunately, there are far too many people in my country and others who see it as a distant threat, that it's a story about polar bears or farmers or fishermen across the world that they will never ever meet. And so I think what we're realizing as journalists and storytellers is that the story has to change. We have to connect the dots between everybody's personal well-being, what's happening to their family, their finances, to these global phenomena, because everything is connected. And with all due respect to my fellow panelists, and I don't envy them having to go to COPs and try to negotiate over language and get something that almost 200 countries can agree on, but it took 26 conference of parties for them to even say the word coal, to even talk about the sources of the problems. And unfortunately, we're running out of time. And we have to come to grips with the idea that in order to meet the goals that are being laid out, all of the pledges of COPs and then these, we're going to need an entirely new way of life, new energy systems, new airplanes, new kinds of cement for buildings, new housing, new transportation. And that's a lot for us to absorb. You know, all the things we think made humanity superior now, it turns out, are hurting us and are threatening your generation, the generation of my baby boy. And that is a lot. And you have to sort of go through the 5 stages of grief to realize that one way or another, the planet Earth that I grew up on is gone now. And the Cinderella climate that gave us, you know, the richest economies in the world and can support 7 billion people around the world is gone. And we have to not only try to mitigate the causes of this and in the ways that all the delegates are talking about, that is getting off of fuels that burn as fast as possible, but we also have to brace for what's already built into the system, an adaptation. And I see it in cities like Charleston, South Carolina, where they're building $1 billion seawall to protect themselves from rising sea levels. And people are just now starting to connect the dots between what's happening in the Greenland ice sheet with what's happening in the deep south of the United States. And so I think eventually all journalists are going to be climate journalists, whether they like it or not, sort of the way that all reporters became public health experts and vaccine immunologist experts had to during the COVID pandemic. And I think we can learn a lot of lessons from that sort of global emergency in what happens when life as we know it, when our predictable world shuts down and you're not guaranteed a flight to see your grandmother, or you're not guaranteed flights to see a theater show anymore. It gives us hope in that when scientists from around the world work together, we can come up with amazing vaccines in an amazingly short amount of time. But then you see the political and the human responses to that. Those who don't believe in the science, who don't want to get the vaccine, who, for various reasons, just because of the stories that they've been told and believe in, don't see the miracle of that scientific achievement. And I hope we can learn from that lesson, and we can realize that a less habitable world becomes a less hospitable world. And now is the time to connect communities. We saw during the COVID pandemic that the communities that waited for their citizens to start dying before they acted suffered the most, but those who rallied together with belief in the scientists got out relatively unscathed. But we're still working our way through this. And unfortunately, given the time scale and our ability to adapt to new discomfort, is why we're sort of in the position we're in. But we are all made of stories, and systems are made of human stories. And the sooner we change that, the sooner we talk to each other and can connect with each other over our shared values, and to connect with even those who may not believe the science, but they know that something has changed. There's not as many fish in this water as there were when I was a boy, or the smoke in the air is thicker. Making those connections is vital for us to move past a point of arguing over the cause of the fire or whether or not there is a fire, but how we can collectively put it out.
شكرا سيد بيل واير، المذيع والكاتب والمنتج ومراسل شؤون
Thank you, Mr. Wire. Now I give the floor to Ms. Yolande Wright, the Global Director of Child Poverty, Climate and Urban at Save the Children. And of course, climate change affects all of us, but they particularly affect youth. And the issue of climate migration, how does this cast, does climate change cast its shadows on this?
Everyone, Excellencies, Honourable Prime Minister, distinguished guests and fantastic youth representatives from around the world gathering in Sharm el-Sheikh today. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you all. As others have already mentioned, the climate crisis is most definitely a crisis for the youth and for children, because it's young people, it's children, it's the babies that people have been talking about that are going to be living through a very different climate, a very different life than that the older generation, such as myself, have lived through. And that's what I wanted to try and talk about today, and how important it is that we make the progress that we need to see from Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh and beyond, and use this really critical decade, the 8 years that John Kerry talked about, to really make the transformations we need to see. So one of the things I wanted to mention is exactly as you said, that children are going to be seeing a very different world. We brought out some research last year with Bray University in Brussels, looking at climate predictions and the impacts on a baby born in 2020, and how different it was from the impacts on their grandfather or grandmother born in, say, 1960. And it was really a shocking report. Globally, on average, a baby born in 2020 will face 2 times more wildfires, 3 times more river floods, 7 times more heat waves. But we also looked at the regional differentiation. And again, I found that quite shocking. And I think for those of you gathered in Egypt today, it will be particularly pertinent to recognize that for countries in the Middle East, for countries in North Africa, the number of heat waves are even more extreme. There'll be up to 9 times more heat waves. More extreme events like floods, again, 3 times more floods for that region of the world. And so these impacts affect everybody, as we were hearing, and there is a thread that links every single person in the whole of the world with this issue. But there are some inequalities in those impacts, and some people in some places, some families, some children will be particularly worst affected. And unfortunately, it is those countries and those families with the lowest income, who perhaps can least afford to cope with the shocks that are coming, that will face those biggest shocks. So I think there's no doubt now about the science. I think one of the big things about last year, not only was the COP conference, but was also the big report that came out that said the scientists all over the world are unequivocal now in saying climate change is happening. It's not happening in the future, it's happening now. And it's no longer in doubt that it's absolutely through human-induced climate change, that we are causing this to happen, and that we can now also recognize that we can do something about it. And it's those actions, what can we do about it, that we really need to be accelerating. And otherwise, we know that children will be the first and worst to suffer. And just right now, as I speak, it's horrific to think that we're predicting that this year an increasing number of people will be needing humanitarian aid. So the estimate from the UN that came out in December is that 274 million people this year, around half of which will be children, will be needing humanitarian assistance. Some of that's as a result of COVID, some of that's as a result of conflict, but a huge amount of it is as a result of the climate crisis, of droughts that are affecting areas such as the Horn of Africa and southern Madagascar, of unprecedented extreme events that are hitting places in Asia, such as the Philippines, which suffered from another really strong cyclone, which are getting ever stronger as global sea temperatures are rising. So when we're tackling the road from Sharm el-Sheikh to COP27, we need to think about tackling these inequalities. We need to think about how we bring it into our thoughts, those suffering on the front line of the climate crisis. So we need to reflect on some of the commitments that were made in Glasgow, and how do we really ensure that those commitments are met. There was an unprecedented number of commitments that many people have mentioned, including on financing. But we really need to make sure that that financing is delivered at the levels that are needed. And of course, we need financing for mitigation, for tackling the root causes, for all these renewable energy projects, etc., that we've seen that Egypt are really taking a huge leadership role on. Of course, we need to tackle the root cause and find new green solutions to meeting our energy needs, to
أنا
meeting our
بعتذر
transport
عن
needs, to
المقاطعة
meeting our...
I'm sorry to be interrupting you, Miss Yolande. I'm sorry to be interrupting you, but unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I would like to thank you for your intervention. Miss Yolande Wright, Global Director, Child Poverty, Climate and Urban at Save the Children. Thank you so much. And now I give the floor to Mr. Fabrizio Carboni, Regional Director of Near and Middle East ICRC. Mr. Fabrizio. He's with us remotely. And sir, if you could please speak to us briefly about the role played by the Red Cross, especially when it comes to conflict areas regarding countering climate change.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. And to be honest, I'm a bit humbled to speak about the climate crisis in front of the Youth Forum, because we cannot ignore that my generation is accountable to the world we're going to live to this new generation. And for the time being, we can't say that we're doing a great work. So we've heard during this conference that climate and environmental crisis is affecting everyone. But we are not all affected to the same degrees, and our capacity to fight and to adapt to climate change are not equal. In the ICRC, we work in conflict-affected countries, and we see that they are less able to adapt to climate change because of the disruptive effect of wars. It includes weakened governance and institutions that drastically limit the countries' and communities' capacity to adapt to changing climate. Therefore, there is a need for greater support to help people cope with and adapt to climate change in most fragile states. Holding the upcoming COP in Egypt, we believe, is a great opportunity because the country lies in two of the regions most vulnerable to climate change, Africa and Middle East. And it's an opportunity to stress on the need of major and urgent political efforts to reduce the impact of climate risk on people and the environment. As ICRC, what we try to do is to reinforce the capacity of affected community to become more resilient to shocks resulting from changing climate and degraded environments, and also to reduce people exposure through anticipatory action. There is also a specificity to our organization because we believe that the respect of the law of armed conflict, the humanitarian law, which protects the natural environment, limits also the risks that community are exposed to and contribute to make them way more resilient. The climate crisis matters to us because we are seeing in the field how it's deepening the vulnerability of the people we work with. And yet, climate action fails to reach them, in part because of the challenges attached to working in such surroundings. But this needs absolutely to change. So how do we try to address this? Is that we're tackling the issue both at the strategic political level and at the operational level to make sure that the conflict-affected population adapts to changing climate. Across the Middle East and Africa region, the ICRC focus on sustainable access to water, and it's at the same time the supply of water and obviously the way we use water. We work on hydraulic system development. We develop them maybe in poorest area around the world. And the idea is to contribute in solving massive water shortages by increasing the resilience of the water systems and avoid system shutdown due to factors like lack of electricity or maintenance. The systems are interconnected. When one fails, the other can too. For example, a water treatment plant depends on electricity. When there is not enough power supply, dirty water isn't treated and it's pumped into the sea. So in the ICIC, we have resilience program aims to understand these systems and how they interconnected and find ways to increase their resilience to shock. We are also supporting agriculture with ecological insect traps and establishing seed banks, and by supporting the rehabilitation of irrigation schemes, the production of animal feed or seeds.
No.
We also have to work on protecting community from flood and erosion. For instance, we are rehabilitating terraces and riverbanks with metallic gabions, repairing damaged pumping station, and in protecting the sewage system from sea erosion.
نعم.
So now going towards the COP27, when collectively we need to do more to live up to our commitment to support the most vulnerable in face of the growing climate crisis, so they can adapt in a safer manner to avoid unavoidable changes. We urge the party to the UNFCCC to acknowledge and draw attention to the particular vulnerability to climate risks of countries and communities enduring conflict, as it is essential to ensure adequate climate action in these settings. We are calling for greater support to help people cope with and adapt to climate change in fragile states. Despite the clear vulnerability.
شكرا. طيب إذا كنا يعني تحدثنا
If we have addressed, if we talked about the efforts conducted by the government, civil society, private sector, and we talked about the media, it's very important to talk about the role of startups and the private sector in this important topic. And those who are trying to solve this problem will be the youth. So it's very important to be engaged. If you will excuse me to speak quickly. Now, Mr. Aqil Hajjat, the founder of C12 in Africa for consultations. Through your experience, you provide environmental and developmental consultations in Africa. How this issue and the issue of climate change affect development efforts, in particularly in Africa, and what's the role of startups in this issue?
Thank you. I'll try and be brief as well. I think the private sector has an absolutely critical role to play in this issue, particularly in an African context. I'll give you the example of my country, Malawi, which is where we face a suite of multiple challenges from a development perspective. We have a rapidly growing population, we have economic challenges, we have governance challenges, and then we are supposed to deal with the development challenges issued by with climate change. Leveraging the private sector has proven to be one of the most effective ways of doing just that. I'll give you two examples, with one which is the Mpatamanga hydro project, which effectively doubles the country's energy supply, electricity supply, and that's leveraged through a public-private sector partnership. Another is the Shiri Basin River Basin Transformation Project, which provides irrigation infrastructure to 2 southern districts and a multitude of farmers, again, through the private sector. These are both PPPs. Even here in Egypt, this model has been successful, having seen billions of dollars across 58 projects since 1990. So it's a very familiar concept for the African nations, but it needs to be captured in a way which aligns with sustainable development goals under the Paris Agreement. John Kerry said we have 8 years to tackle this issue and that we're not moving fast enough. Well, the private sector is fast enough. Private sector is nimble, it is adaptable, and it's capable of moving at the speeds that we require. It also contains the technical capacity to bridge knowledge gaps and can provide a similar technical assistance resource to what we see with the Santiago network. The key is understanding how to leverage this and strategically look at the sector, prioritizing climate-smart development. If you want to break it down to basics, you will see that companies act for two reasons. The first is because they have to, that is to do with regulation, and the second is because they want to, and that is to do with market opportunities, it's to do with business cases, and it's to do with incentives. Balancing these two aspects is the way to channel the private sector towards helping to align with the broad goals in dealing with this issue. And for me, finally, this links to a key issue for young people. Young people need decent work and opportunities. The youth of Malawi, for example, where I'm from, are not interested in scratching a subsistence living like their forefathers. They want good jobs, and we need to be able to understand that and set up a business environment which caters for that in a sustainable and climate-smart way. Thank you.
شكرا وشكرا للإيجاز أيضا.
Thank you so much, Mr. Aqil, for being so brief. And thank you for your valuable words. Now I give the floor to Mr. Karim Tarraf. You are the founder of Hawa Dawa, and you have endeavors in measuring air pollution. You also provide relevant data to governance in this regard. So the question here is, how can companies help governments and communities in attaining clean air? Thank you. First, I would like to thank His Excellency the President and the organizers of the conference for this opportunity. I would like to speak to you about Hawa Dawa's experience. We focus on air pollution and climate change because air pollutants have very negative impacts, and we cannot achieve our climate goals without focusing on these pollutants that affect climate and health. So when the governments want to measure such pollutants, they buy huge containers that need constant maintenance. And since such data touch all aspects of life, the coverage of these stations are not enough. There are more than 100 countries that don't have the capacities to measure air pollution, and even countries that invest heavily in this area have one station for every 2 million citizens. So in Hawa Dawa, what we did was that we employed artificial intelligence in order to use it in smaller devices that could be used in many areas where we can collect data, not only about pollutants, but also about traffic, wind, population, so that we would be able to track the hotspots in order to have certain short-term policies and strategies to tackle the underlying issues. So this is really the role of emerging companies or enterprises. Here we're speaking about the very short term. We're speaking about 8 years, and also we have the challenge of rapidly changing technologies. So we need to be able to cater to the relevant needs under these two challenges. And hence I think that entrepreneurial projects are very important therein. Thank you so much, Mr. Karim. Thank you so much. I would like to apologize to Mr. Marco Schultz, but now I would like to give the floor to His Excellency President Abdel Fattah Sisi to comment. I just want to tell you that we should give the opportunity to our guests to speak. His Excellency the President says that we should give the opportunity, then the opportunity shall be given. Thank you so much, Your Excellency. What I wanted to mention is that youth-based companies have the the opportunity and the capacity to have scalable work models or business models. And this is the startups system of work. And this is exactly what we need in COP27, because if we don't do this, then we will be speaking about risks and technologies without any bridge between them. There will always be a gap. And so there won't be any improvement of policies, their efficiency. And if we work without data, then this cannot be done, really. Thank you so much. I really apologize for interrupting you, but since you spoke about technology, then I think that this is one of the fields that Mr. Marco Schlitz is really interested in. Mr. Marco Schlitz, could you please speak to us a little bit about the role played by technology in this issue?
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Thank you, Excellencies. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience, for engaging in this really important discussion. And let me start off with a brief anecdote, and I promise I will keep it short. I recently watched the movie Don't Look Up, and the storyline goes like that. Two researchers are finding a comet that is bound to hit and destroy Earth, and we have 6 months and 14 days remaining. The outcome is humanity fails and we all die. Only a handful of individuals are escaping Earth on a spaceship. And yes, this storyline is meant to represent our current climate situation. However, the makers of this movie get one detail very wrong. In our situation, these two researchers would have never been able to detect the comet in time. Our climate accounting systems are simply not sufficient to detect what is going on right now in our world. For example, China submitted their last climate data in 2019 using data that is from 2012, so 10-year-old data. The European Union and my home country, Germany, submitted their last data in 2019 using 2016-17 data. Egypt submitted their data in 2019 using 2015 data. The US submitted their data in 2021, but also only using 2019 data. So at the time when this data is getting submitted, it is already outdated. And I'm not pointing any fingers on countries. These are just examples, but I could put my fingers at every single country in the world right now. It is a systemic issue that our accounting systems are simply not sufficient to deal with the global coordination challenge that we're currently facing. So that is my answer to why do we need technology and why do we need to innovate our climate system. We have the potential now with emerging digital technologies like the Internet of Things, Karim was mentioning it, with remote sensing capabilities where we look at the holistic Earth system rather than at just single actors and trying to make them report whatever they are doing. We have machine learning that is already ruling our social networks that we can also use for a good purpose by using it to verify data and predict what do we need to change to support policy making. And we have distributed ledger technology or blockchain that makes data accessible to everyone in a trustless manner. But this innovation cannot happen in isolation, but we need a group of very different actors to collaborate on this. And there are 3 key actors in this group. The one is represented here with non-state actors and companies that can move very fast and have the capacity to innovate themselves and drive change. We have subnational actors like cities and regions that are driving ambition at the subnational level. We have countries from the global south that have already vast experiencing in leapfrogging into digital technologies and innovate themselves because they don't have the capacities to do the accounting that is needed right now. And then, most importantly probably, and that's the reason why I'm here, is the youth. The youth is a digitally emerging generation that is already digitally native, and their voice is getting louder and clearer every day. So what we need to, in order to dodge this climate comet, to come back to the initial story, is to think about how can we integrate the lessons from the youth and how can we support them and learn from them and develop future systems together, to hold our actors accountable, but also to enable them to make policy making that is looking forward and to really design the future systems rather than just focusing on criticizing the status quo. شكرا.
شكرا ماركو شلتز الباحث والاستشاري في Open Earth Foundation، واكيد انه في هذا الملتقى منتدى شباب العالم
And definitely in the world, and definitely in the World Youth Forum, this will be an opportunity for discussing this issue. Now I give the floor to His Excellency President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Thank you so much. Allow me at the outset to welcome you, to thank you for this fruitful discussion of this very important topic. And I would like to thank you a lot for being a catalyzing force for COP27 that will be held in Sharm el-Sheikh this year. I will be speaking maybe from a different perspective. In fact, the human beings are the only creatures on the face of the earth who are capable of destroying, but they are also capable of reforming and restoring. So they are capable of both human beings. And so I won't be saying that I don't sense the danger that you're speaking about, that we're all speaking about, but I'll be speaking to you about the Egyptian experience briefly throughout the past years. But I just wanted to start out with telling you this in order for you to hear it. And I'm addressing the youth, our youth in Egypt and the youth of the world. God has created human beings capable of development, capable of building. So any negative developments that you see, be certain that we have the capacities to counter them. I'm not speaking about certain aspects or certain fields. I'm speaking about the all of life aspects. And I will give you a simple example. In New York, in the US, around 100 years, maybe 120, 130 years, the amount of the dung of horses there, sometimes it reached 5 stories high, and sometimes it led to the death of people. And this was the beginning of people having to do something about it. And this is exactly what I'm speaking about. So this was the catalyst for starting the manufacture of automobiles in the US. And I think that this was an opportunity spotted by Ford, the famous Ford. And through this, the automobile industry has started. And of course, this is something that we're speaking about now in terms of emissions. We are speaking about the next 8 years. But what I'm saying does not mean that as leaders, as people in charge, even as listeners, should not perceive danger. But what you should always be sure of is that this danger will be countered, will be tackled, as I said, by everybody, one way or another, because there is an inherent opportunity there. I mean, how many millions of vehicles do we have in the world? I think hundreds of millions. So imagine in these 8 years the amount of electric cars that we could manufacture, or even cars that run by electricity and gas. Maybe they would reach 10%, 20%. This is the real opportunity that we can use, replacing the huge number of cars that run on fossil fuel. All of this could be turned to cars that run on renewables. In Egypt, we perceived that, just like everybody did, but we moved, and we moved quickly. And here I'm speaking about vehicles and cars. And more than 5 years ago, we spoke to the relevant companies to have electric cars industry in Egypt, and we did start to have initiatives for replacing the cars. First, to replace their fuel with gas, and then as of 2023, like His Excellency the Prime Minister mentioned, we are going to have the first Egyptian electric car in the market. This means that we in Egypt know that this is a car that is very expensive to manufacture. It needs a huge infrastructure for it to be able to function. So this means that we are moving in this on this track. So if we in all our countries in the private sector perceive the opportunities lying in the procedures of climate change, then we're all going to move. I will also give you 2 examples from Egypt that were for us opportunities. Dr. Mustafa spoke about the lakes and the amount of pollution and contamination in these lakes. I'm speaking here about a topic that hasn't been tackled for tens or hundreds of years in Egypt. And for 4 years, we've been working on a program to purify and clean these lakes. And this will lead to creating job opportunities for those working on this process. And also these lakes will turn into an economic energy for the country, an economic asset. Also, the Decent Life Haya Karima project that His Excellency the Prime Minister spoke about, it aims at changing the lives of 60 million Egyptian citizens through the lining of canals. Here we're speaking about 40,000 kilometers of canals that are going to cost us more than 80 billion Egyptian pounds. This, however, means that there are going to be jobs created for those working on these processes, in addition to the means of transport and so on. So despite the fact that we had a crisis that we needed to counter, that was very costly to work on, but at the end we need to see the light at the end of the tunnel, the opportunities that lie there, in the core of which is climate reform. Also, when we speak about the reform of road networks in Egypt, some people thought that we exaggerated in regards to the size of this project. We're speaking about 6, 7, 8 lanes with huge proportions, but this actually means that we were targeting reducing traffic in order to reduce emissions. So it's like domino effect. And in Egypt, we shoulder a lot of costs, but still we solve the problem. And Egypt, like His Excellency said, has a very small contribution to the global emissions. However, we paid attention to that and we moved on towards its goals very efficiently. And this is why I'm addressing our youth. The will to change is very important. Destroying our Mother Earth is something that human beings are capable of, but still but still we can work on warning people through the media, through social media, so that people would move towards countering this, because this in itself is an opportunity. Because if we target changing X million of cars that run on fossil fuel to cars that run on renewables, then I think that this will mean that we have an opportunity. Human beings will remain the developers until the human beings believe that they are the masters of the universe. Once they reach this belief, then the universe will end at this point. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt. Thank you so much to our dear panelists, and thanks to the guests. Now the session is adjourned. Thank you.